You are cleared to proceed with your sortie, Blue 4.
So today for Ancient DOS Games, we're going to be taking a look at XF5700 Mantis Experimental Fighter, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it Mantis from here on out. But this is a game that I was initially surprised I'd never heard of before, as when I was offered a sealed boxed copy and I looked up online, it looked like something which would have been right up my alley back as a kid. Then I actually sat down to play this game, and yeah, I understand why this game flew under my radar. It's average. Like, painfully average. This game doesn't really do anything wrong. I mean, it plays fine, but every little aspect of it is just screaming to be better developed and fleshed out. And here's what makes it even weirder. Mantis is technically ripping off Wing Commander, but Wing Commander is technically ripping off Mantis. See, Wing Commander originally came out in 1990 and set the stage for bringing a whole cinematic perspective to space combat games. But then Mantis comes along in 1992, and while it was originally released on floppy disk, the copy I have is a CD-enhanced version which came out right around the end of the same year and features FMV sequences to help tell the story. But then Wing Commander 3 came out exactly 2 years later and did the whole FMV thing right. So yeah, Mantis isn't a bad game, but there's just nothing here that stands out enough to make it interesting to warrant the many hours it takes to clear all 90 of its missions. Yeah, 90. There is definitely a quantity over quality vibe going on here. Mantis was the last game developed by Paragon Software before they were absorbed into MicroProse, who subsequently published the game in 1992 under their MicroPlay label. And it's best described as a one-player simulation game, or space combat sim if you want to get more specific. It supports VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, and a typical array of audio devices. As for its current release state, it's still commercial and no official digital downloads have popped up yet as of this video. But fortunately, this is one of the easier games to get in a physical form factor, as it's fairly common and reasonably priced, with loose copies going for between $5 and $10, and even fully boxed copies typically selling for between $15 and $20, even when factory sealed. Now, that said, even though the different releases of the game are usually priced similarly, the 3.5-inch disc version is by far the easiest to come across, with the CD-ROM version that I'm covering being a bit harder to find but not impossible, while the 5.25-inch disc release is definitely the rarest, as I only found one listing for it during my searches. But again, it was priced really well. I should also point out that a speech pack was released for the disc-based versions to add speech to the gameplay, and also to a few of the more important cinematic sequences, but I have no idea what that's worth as I couldn't find any copies of it online at all. WeirdProc originally sent this to me still sealed, but for some reason I had decided to unbox it ahead of time, and I believe the reasoning was because there was a question as to its authenticity. But this is definitely a legit copy, and in fact, even though I took the shrink wrap off, I left it on the CD, so you'll get to see that in a moment here. But yeah, the CD release of the game comes in this thin box, which is perfectly sized to fit the CD inside, whereas the disc-based copies all came in a standard big box typical of PC releases. There's actually quite a few things in this box here, though nothing out of the ordinary. First up, we have the warranty and customer service registration card, which is typical for the time, followed by the flight control sheet, which is freaking invaluable because the manual does a really poor job of explaining the controls. Though ironically, once you know how to play, you're going to find that you only really need to ever use a handful of these controls. And then we have the actual software license and warranty sheet, which is actually printed on extremely thick cardstock instead of a sheet of paper, which I find kind of curious. And then we have the manual. Right off the bat, something I find incredibly odd is this shiny silver badge representing the organization you're a part of in this game. Well, not its presence, but rather how it's been applied. Well, instead of being a decal, this was printed onto the cover using a low-resolution source image. So it not only looks incredibly ugly because of jagged lines and inconsistent line thickness, but it's also off-center and crooked. Actually, despite that messy emblem on the front, the manual's been laid out pretty well for the most part, with 2-color green and black printing inside and high-quality paper, and goes over all kinds of aspects of the game, including an insanely detailed backstory. Again, though, the controls are not described very well in here, and aren't described in the game itself at all, so make sure you keep that flight control sheet handy. Oh yeah, and the shrink wrap on the CD here actually has one of those easy pull strips to get it open. So let's see how well that works 28 years later. Yep, that's a CD, alright.
Tens of thousands of creatures emerged from the bodies of living humans. Where they came from and how they incubated in the human body was initially unknown.
So, despite there being a massive backstory to this game, I can actually sum it up pretty easily. Take the plot for the Starship Troopers movie, make humans the breeding vessel for the bugs, remove every ounce of satire, and then make it take place in the same year as One Must Fall 2097, and there you go. Now obviously that's a gross simplification of it all, so here's what's actually going on. An insect-like alien race known as the Sirians, named after the part of the galaxy Earth observed them coming from, was facing extinction on their homeworld. Now these bugs would reproduce using a gestational period requiring a host body, but the only suitable life forms ended up being wiped out due to cataclysmic disasters. So, unable to reproduce, the Sirians stole the technology of the life forms they abused and set their sights to the stars. And the first planet they discovered with a life form suitable to their reproductive processes was a little blue ball many light years away known as Earth. The war started rather abruptly in March of 2094, when out of nowhere, the Sirians launched a worldwide nuclear assault on Earth to wipe out the majority of the population in order to better control the remaining population, which the Sirians immediately started using as breeding stock to implant their eggs and bolster their numbers. Now, Earth's response to this was to form a temporary unified task force known as FOE, the Fist of Earth, which was immediately set to task to develop vaccinations and weapons with which to fight back. The story for the game itself takes place in 2097, 3 years after the initial invasion, where Earth has finally been cleared of the Sirians, but the threat of attack from them continues. To combat the remaining Sirians, FOE has developed a spacecraft known as the XF5700 Mantis, which is technically still experimental, but is proving so effective that they've built tons of these, and are training numerous pilots to utilize its impressive firepower. You play the role of one particular pilot who's just getting his feet wet with the Mantis, who's only ever referred to by his call sign, Viper. Before I move on with the gameplay though, I just have to say, for as much backstory as there is, they really cut corners on the FMVs. Now I understand that this was still the very early days of FMVs in video games, so there wasn't a lot to compare to, but the acting in these FMVs is just plain bad, and not even in a funny way. In fact, looking up the credits, it's apparent that many of these people were likely just friends or colleagues of the people making the game, or were actually working on the game itself, so it's kind of hard to fault them for a lack of acting talent. But yeah, everyone delivers their lines as though they're reading them to a wall, everyone's inflections are all wrong, no one reacts in believable ways, there's a sort of monotone thing going on throughout. It's actually kind of hard to watch these FMVs because there's nothing riffable about them. Well, I mean, aside from the fact that to save space, they just captured everyone's heads, then paste those video captures on top of non-moving body pieces, which they didn't even have to do because they only ended up using a quarter of the space on the CD anyways. But yeah, when you consider Wing Commander 3 had actual actors and everything, it's no wonder it blew this game clear out of the sky when it hit the scene. When you first boot up the game, you have to create a pilot file. Now this pilot is auto-saved every time you complete or fail a mission, which isn't very obvious at first, because you have save game and load game buttons. But what these are actually doing is creating a copy of your pilot file, or loading a different pilot file. Now given the fact that you can't go back and do missions over, keeping backups is kind of a good idea if you want to try and go through without failing anything. You also have access to a database and a training simulator. Now, the database isn't all that useful really, but does stay up to date with the technology you have access to, or will have access to in the near future, along with any new things you encounter in your missions. Now, likewise, the training simulator also stays up to date, adding in new enemies you can fight against as you encounter them in the actual missions. Despite the name though, the training sim is pretty much just a combat arena. Select some opponents and fight them. Though the game will try to give you helpful, context-sensitive voice tips during the process, some of which are good, and some of which are Also, before each mission, you're able to arm your Mantis fighter with ordnances and fuel. Now, this part of the game could have been really freaking cool, except you're severely limited in what you can actually do with this, and there's never a reason, at least as far as I can tell, to equip less than you're capable of. Sure, you could leave a few missiles out and maybe store away less fuel and get a little bit more acceleration out of your thrusters because you weigh less, but as you're going to see in a second, it really doesn't matter at all. So, the gameplay itself. Right off the bat, this is clearly taking hints from Wing Commander. You have to warp, or rather quad jump, to your destination sector, perform your mission, quad jump back, and then land on Sol Base to end the mission. Now, occasionally there's a layover quadrant you need to jump to between Sol Base and the destination, but it's all handled automatically, so you never have to set any jump coordinates or anything like that. As for the combat, well, this isn't as exciting as it first looks. Well, the irony is that the main draw of the game's combat is also its main weakness, in that it's based on Newtonian physics, or rather, is trying to emulate how real spaceflight works. Now, unlike a plane, which generally moves in the direction it's facing in because of the movement of air across its control surfaces, the lack of any friction in space means any momentum generated is kept, regardless of which direction you're facing in. And on top of that, there's no speed limit. The more you thrust in one direction, the faster you will go in that direction. And furthermore, any momentum you already had is kept if you're not explicitly countering it. So for instance, using cardinal directions to simplify this, if you accelerate to move north at 1,000 kilometers an hour, but then accelerate to move west at 2,000 kilometers an hour, you're now moving in a northwest-west direction at about 2,200 kilometers an hour because you still have that initial north moving momentum. And there's a few things which complicate this with this game in particular as well. The first is that you don't have a speedometer. I mean, of all the things that should be in a spacecraft with Newtonian physics, you'd think a speedometer would be one of them, but nope. Instead, you get these little particle effects to represent the direction you're moving in with a rough approximation of speed. Now, this is made more confusing by the fact that you have a throttle, but it doesn't work like an actual throttle. Instead, it's simply determining how much thrust is applied for every moment you hold the thrust button down for. The throttle is useless. The game even flat out tells you in the manual and in the training to set the throttle to 100%. There is never any reason whatsoever to use less than 100% throttle in this game. And yeah, because of the focus on realism and the physics, the combat itself isn't very engaging. Now, firstly, it's nearly impossible to hit anything with manual controls, given that your mass drivers and plasma cannons don't track enemy targets, have limited range, and because you need to lead everything. This means if you want to actually hit anything with any level of reliability, you have to get used to the game's autopilot feature, which is overcomplicated to put it mildly. The autopilot has 8 modes, well, technically 9. And the idea is that each mode serves a particular purpose to help aid you in spaceflight. But I found that you're pretty much only going to be using 4 modes, 1, 3, 7, and 9. Mode 1 is manual control, so not technically an autopilot mode. Mode 3 is what you're going to be using the most, as it points you towards the lead indicator for your selected target and provides thrust when appropriate in an attempt to intercept your target. Now, this mode is pretty much required to use if you want to hit anything, but since it takes away all control, you pretty much just turn it on and wait for the right moments to fire. It also doesn't work very well at long range, so for those purposes, you can use Mode 2 to lock your view onto a target while maintaining manual control of your thrusters, or you can use Mode 1 to close in first, then switch to Mode 3 once close enough to start attacking. Mode 4 is a quote-unquote creep mode that I never found a use for. Mode 5 and 6 are technically not modes, but rather make adjustments to how your ship is flying, supposedly. I never got them to do much of anything. Mode 7 orients you to face the direction your momentum is carrying you in, Mode 8 is the opposite, and Mode 9 brings you to a full stop. So yeah, you actually don't spend a lot of time in manual control given how difficult it is to hit anything. However, there is one aspect of the game which does bring at least some semblance of excitement into the mix, and that's evasive maneuvers. And none of the enemies in the game fight back with direct firing weapons, instead opting exclusively to use missiles. Now the Mantis is equipped with a pair of auto-aiming point defense weapons designed to lock onto and shoot down enemy missiles when they get too close. However, missiles are fast, and if you've got more than just one chasing you down, these point defense weapons aren't going to be able to get them all with each pass. So this is when taking manual control becomes essential, as you want to do your best to keep the missiles at your sides as you thrust forwards, as this makes it difficult for the missiles to adjust their trajectory enough to be able to hit you. Whereas if they're coming from straight ahead or straight behind your direction of movement, they're more than capable of making the minor adjustments necessary to make contact. And once you're down to a single missile lock or no missile locks, you can go back to autopilot mode 3 and start gunning down hostiles again. And yeah, virtually every mission in the game with combat is just warp somewhere, shoot some enemies, warp back, land. There's a little bit of variety here and there with escorts and missions where you have to protect targets, but there's not only very few of these missions, but they also play out very poorly. And one particular escort mission has no combat at all, and all you have to do is get close to the escort and come to a stop. Now it tells you to use autopilot mode 5 to handle this, but again, I had trouble getting that to do much of anything. So I opted for manual control and just carefully got close to it. There's also a mission, I kid you not, which is over and done in seconds. Just watch.
You are cleared to proceed with your sortie booth, boy. Roger, control. Kangaroos to escort. You may jump when ready. Viper, you may return to base. Blue 4, you are cleared to land.
I didn't even have to touch the controls. All I did was quad jump again, land, done. Yeah, when you have missions like that in the queue, it's no wonder they managed to fit 90 of them in here. As I said at the start, Mantis isn't a bad game, it's just an extremely average game, clearly inspired by Wing Commander, trying to be unique with its depiction of real space physics, but falls flat as an entertaining experience. Don't get me wrong, its use of FMV this early on was definitely a novel concept, as very few FMV-based games existed before this one, at least in terms of the home market. But beyond that, there's just nothing here to hold a player's attention. I mean, just to give you an idea of how barren the variety is, guess how many unique, digitized sound effects exist for the sim portions of the game, not counting speech? 11. There's only 11 sound effects used during combat. Interestingly enough, this wouldn't be the last game to attempt to make Newtonian physics interesting from a space combat perspective, as Microsoft themselves took a crack at it in the year 2000 with Allegiance, a space combat and strategy sim using a hybrid spaceflight model where it was primarily Newtonian based but had additional features to make it more interesting and easier to grasp. Now actually, funnily enough, Allegiance went open source at one point, and is now free to download on Steam, so if you want to try a space sim with those kinds of physics and don't mind it being multiplayer only, that's actually one that's worth looking into. Unfortunately, as of this video, the latest stable version of DOSBox, version 0.74-3, has audio issues with this game which do not have a workaround, so you'll need to use a more up-to-date, non-official version of DOSBox. Now, I've tested the latest builds of both DOSBox X and DOSBox ECE, and neither have any sound issues, so use one of them and you'll be good. Beyond that, you need to manually set the core to dynamic mode, set cycles to max, and then if you're using a joystick or gamepad, you also need to turn off timed intervals. A bit more of a hassle to set up than a typical game, but certainly not the worst we've come across. Anywho, that'll be all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week's a filler, and I want to talk about a particular quick basic program I made a long while back, which I haven't shared online yet, which I think might be interesting to showcase and experiment with, now that I'm older and more experienced, so be sure to stay tuned for that.
That's the last of them. Prepare to return to Sol Base.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.